Today we get to talk about something that some people think is the most important. It's money. You've probably heard people say, money isn't everything, but it's sure way ahead of what's in second place. Well, I want to expand our discussion today a little bit. Our theme is becoming more spiritual through generous giving. But I'd like to expand that a bit and say becoming spiritually mature through generous living. And today we have Shane Claiborne on the line. He's from Kensington, Pennsylvania. He's a popular speaker, author. I've got his book here, Jesus for President, that I've appreciated a great deal. And we just want to ask Shane a few questions about generous giving and about generous living. Shane, can you tell us a little bit about the Simple Way and the kind of involvements you've been having there in Kensington?
Sure. Well, I am a Tennessee boy. I grew up down south and ended up in Philadelphia 20 years ago, originally to go to school. But then while we were in college, there was a group of families that were living on the streets. Many of them were moms and children. And they had nowhere to go, and so they moved into an abandoned Catholic church building, this big cathedral just a couple miles from where I live now, and they started living there, and we got involved as students at the time, and that's the Simple Way kind of bubbled up out of that. They were brilliant. The families had hung a banner that said, "We can worship a homeless man on Sunday, but how can we ignore one on Monday?" You know, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? And it was catalytic for us. So we started the Simple Way out of that. We now have a little village of homes in this neighborhood. We've been doing a lot of abandoned housing that we fix up into homes and community gardens and things like that. So that's sort of our roots, are with families that were struggling deeply economically. And we're also really inspired by the early church in the book of Acts, where as the Holy Spirit fell on them, you know, at Pentecost, where we mark as the birthday of the church, one of the outflowings of that was everybody shared. You know, it says no one claimed any of their possessions were their own, but they shared everything they had. And offerings were brought to the apostles' feet, and they were given out to people who had need. That's what we used to do with the tithes and offerings, you know. But it was amazing because it ends in the book of Acts. There's this beautiful scripture where it says there were no needy persons among them. That they began to end poverty because they lived generously and they held their possessions with open hands. So that's very much kind of a cornerstone of the things that we're trying to live out here at the Simple Way.
Part of the transformation was they became giving people rather than just getting people, and there's quite a bit of difference between those two.
Surely, and it really all comes back to this idea that we're to love our neighbors as ourselves. You know, and when you think of the global neighborhood that we live in, it's very dysfunctional. A study just showed that 85 people, Forbes magazine said 85 of the richest people in the world now own the same amount as half the world's population, 3.5 billion people. And so when we think about what is the world God dreamed of? And it's not a world where masses of people live in poverty while a handful of people live however they want.
So what difference does Jesus make in all of this?
Jesus makes all the difference in the world, because I think he reorients us to what really matters and says things like, where your heart is, there your treasure will be also, and challenging the way that we stockpile, saying, live like the lilies and the sparrows. You know, consider these. They don't worry about tomorrow, and God takes care of them. So there's this sort of invitation to live with uncalculated generosity, you know, to not stockpile in barns for tomorrow. Jesus tells this beautiful story about a man who stores up all of his extra stuff in barns and doesn't have enough, has to keep building bigger barns. And then God looks down and says, "You fool." Like you don't even know what tomorrow holds. And so I think that's like it's a critique of our culture. But Jesus also teaches us love. And when we love our neighbor, it changes the way that we think about economics. So when Zacchaeus meets Jesus, he immediately sells half of everything he owns, and he pays people back 4 times what he owed them. So it changes his economics. And I think, as we look at the things Jesus said, he's selling, sell everything you have and give it to the poor, because that's really the outflow of love.
It seems to me Jesus transforms us so that we become others-oriented rather than just ourselves.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we live in a world where we hear a lot of other gospels, though. When you read the Sermon on the Mount, or you read Jesus' teaching on money, it looks so different from the world that we live in. That Wendell Berry, the great theologian and farmer, he says, yeah, we can put "In God We Trust" on our money, but our economy still looks like the 7 deadly sins. And you look at the Beatitudes of Jesus, where he says, "Blessed are the poor, blessed are the merciful, the meek, the peacemakers." When he goes through this list, it is the antithesis of the things that we have come to celebrate and to adore.
Shane, could you say a little bit about that giving is more than just finances? It's giving of our time, our ideas, our whole self. And I see you as that kind of a person. Or I think of this congregation that canceled all its offerings and went to a new pattern. The first Sunday of the month, they take an offering of money. The second Sunday of the month, they take an offering of time. How much time do they hope to spend in the church and in the community and for the needy? The third Sunday, an offering of ideas. What kind of ideas do you have for the community? Or what should we write the president? Or something like that. The fourth Sunday, an offering of self, in self-dedication, altar calls, commissioning or communion or something like that. And finally, the fifth Sunday, special offering for missions. I like the totality of that giving is not just money, it's all of life. And you have something to say. How have you, in your community, tried to give in all of life?
Well, before we even started the Simple Way, I spent some time at a fairly wealthy megachurch, evangelical megachurch outside of Chicago. And while I was there, I did a survey of people there and at other churches around the country. And one of the things that I asked folks, and these were all folks who in this sample, they were all folks who self-identified as strong Christians. And I asked them, did Jesus spend time with the poor? And like over 90%, 95% or something said, yeah, Jesus spent a lot of time with the poor. Later in the survey, I asked them, do you spend time with the poor? And that's where it struck me that only about 2% of folks who said they were strong Christians said that they had any regular or meaningful interactions with people in poverty. And I realized that we don't just have a compassion problem, maybe not even just a generosity problem, but we have a relationship problem, that often those who have resources don't have many relationships with people who don't. And when I look at some of the campaigns, like I love Bono's campaign, make poverty history, but I think we've also got to make poverty personal. And until we know the names and faces of inequity and injustice, then we may only just be writing checks to charity. And so I think like in the end, Matthew 25 is so beautiful because it's Jesus's final account of judgment. He says all of the nations are going to be gathered before God, and God's going to ask us a few questions. And they're not going to just be doctrinal questions, right? Of virgin birth, agree or disagree. It's not even going to be like how much money we gave to charity or who we voted for. But God's going to say to us, when I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was a stranger, did you welcome me in? When I was in prison, did you come visit me? When I was sick, did you take care of me? And what strikes me is that all of those are relational acts. They're acts of intimate compassion and love.
Shane, in our groups, we're going to be talking a little bit about guidelines for giving. Well, what's your comment on the tithe? We're talking about going beyond the tithe or something different than that. But how can the tithe be helpful to us?
We may want to restructure some of our hymns. All to Jesus I surrender. We could say a tenth to Jesus I surrender instead. But I think like that we actually started reading about the tithe, and a friend of mine wrote an essay about how the tithe was originally meant to be a distribution point of compassion in the early church, but even in the Hebrew scriptures we see this. And he wrote a paper called Embezzlement, the Sin of the Contemporary Church. And he shows how we've often used the tithe to build buildings and pay staff and maintain institutions, but this idea that the tithe was meant to be a part of God's jubilee and redistribution of poor is different. So out of that, we started a group called the Relational Tithe. And it's a handful of us. It started as a handful of us. Now it's hundreds of us. But we began giving 10% of our incomes together. But 100% of that money is given away relationally to friends that we live in proximity to. So when our corner store was robbed at gunpoint, we were able to give a gift to replenish what was lost. When my neighbor's car was vandalized, I went to him and I said, hey, there's a group of us that are Christians that believe in bearing each other's burdens. And we don't think that you should feel alone in this. So we put some of our money together. We want to cover the repairs of your car. Well, he was so moved by that, he wanted to join, So I think it's a part of our witness. And now, we're sharing hundreds of thousands of dollars in a relational way.
Well, Shane has given us a lot to think about and to share. As you go into your groups to share some of the questions that are in the material and the concepts and creative ideas that Shane has shared with us, I hope that you can find some new guidelines or directions for your lives. Jesus says it's more blessed to give than to receive. And I hope that you can experience that and feel the joy of growing in your spiritual life through generous giving, or even more through generous living.